Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Our recent criticisms, both of the Supreme Court and the collegium system, first made by the Law Minister and then by the Vice President, simply an expression of differences of opinion over how judges are chosen? Or are they tantamount to a concerted attack on the judiciary, both well thought through and deliberate? And if it is the latter, how should the Supreme Court respond? Those are two critical issues I shall raise today with the well-known former editor, author, and former cabinet minister in Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government, Arun Shourie. Mr. Shourie, let me start with recent comments made by the Law Minister about the Supreme Court and the collegial system, and then by the Vice President about the primacy of Parliament over the Constitution. In your eyes, are these simply expressions of differences of opinion over how judges are chosen, or do you think this is a concerted attack on the judiciary, both well thought through and deliberate?
Of course, well thought through, and I wouldn't say they are speaking on their own. And no minister in this government speaks on his own. And secondly, even the Vice President, after all, he proved his usefulness in Bengal. And whatever he is saying now is really going to be very useful to the government. And what are they saying? Unelected officials. That's Rijiju's comment, Law Minister's comment. You think the Law Minister will chastise the courts and the Supreme Court judges as unelected officials on his own?
So the ventriloquist behind these two is the Prime Minister?
Of course, no doubt on that. It is part of a general, firstly, this type of name calling is a part of their design. They always give the dog a bad name and kick him. So you say urban Naxals, Tukde gang. You thereby dehumanize the person. And then you can do anything to him.
So this is not just an attack on the Supreme Court, it's an attempt to denigrate the Supreme Court.
Yes, so that you lower its esteem, and then you can say, they are just people who are obstructing things. So that's the point.
So then it's even worse. It's an attack on the Supreme Court would be an attack on certain members of the bench of the Supreme Court. But if you're lowering the institution, which is a constitutional institution, you're actually doing great damage to the temple of justice in the country.
Yes, and to the basic structure. And that is attacked frontally by the Vice President. Please don't look upon them as Law Minister and Vice President. Look upon them as individuals. Will you listen to their comments if they were not occupying these so-called constitutional positions?
Members of the Modi government and BJP supporters hearing you will say, Arun Shourie is exaggerating. He's taking criticism of the collegial system or of judges to the extent of suggesting that a constitutional institution is under attack and under threat. How do you respond to that?
No, but that's what they're doing. What is the Vice President or Dhankar's grouse? It's against what he calls what is known as the basic structure of the Constitution. See, this is not in the Constitution. It has been imported by the judges. This Constitution has been amended 105 times. The essence of those amendments was not in the Constitution. That's why the Constitution was amended. Why was the amendments made? Because the working of the Constitution showed that those things had to be done. Similarly, given the assaults that were coming on the constitutional framework, it's not just one article. There is a framework. The federal principle, secularism, independence of the judiciary, fundamental rights.
These are all part of the basic structure.
The parliamentary system. So you attack the basics. That is why the Supreme Court said, yes, Parliament can amend anything, but not these basic pillars.
And that is what Dhankar is attacking.
Yes, and saying how Parliament is supreme. Parliament is not supreme.
Let's pause and take the points made,
Yes.
first by the Law Minister and then by the Vice President, one by one.
Yes.
Now, the Law Minister, very interestingly, called judges unelected officials.
Yes.
I accept that in contrast, MPs and MLAs have a certain popular mandate, but does it mean that just because judges are deemed to be unelected, they are subordinate to and was subservient to either the executive or the legislature? Because that's what he's suggesting, isn't he?
Right. And firstly, we know what kind of elections these people come through. Then these people display themselves every day, the way they behave towards, let's say, towards the Prime Minister in subservience. The way they behave in, these elected people behave in legislatures across the country. Is that the way you want every institution to behave? Or everybody sitting in every institution to behave? And the fact of the matter is that the judges are much better educated, they are much more disciplined, they are much more hardworking than these elected officials.
And the main point is whether judges are elected or not is irrelevant. Judges are the equal of the legislature and the executive. They are on par with them in our constitution. So to try and deem them as subservient by saying they're unelected is to misunderstand the constitution.
Right, you are right. The constitution made them unelected for a particular reason, that they will not be swayed by popular opinion. They are the anchor.
And therefore, there's a virtue to them being unelected.
Yes.
It means that they are not swayed by public opinion.
Right.
They go by what the dictates of justice demand.
And of the constitution, and they are the guardian. I mean, the phrase used again and again for the judiciary is, they are the guardians of the constitution. If I may just mention this point, Karan, see, the Vice President, Dhankar says, Rijiju says, Parliament is supreme. Parliament is not supreme. The constitution is supreme.
I'll come to that in a moment's time, but let me pick up on a thought embedded in your earlier answer. Rijiju, the law minister, used the term unelected officials to denigrate and to lower the standing of judges. The truth is, the strength and virtue of the judiciary is because it's unelected.
Right.
It therefore can't be swayed by popular opinion or by the whims of the day.
Right.
So what was their strength? He's tried to make a weakness, and he's misunderstood the virtue of being unelected.
But he is an intelligent person. He could not have misunderstood. He is deliberately saying something, understanding fully well why they are.
So this is the attitude of the Modi government to the judiciary. Dismiss them as unelected.
Of course.
Okay, let's come at this point to what the Vice President said. He claimed, both in the Rajya Sabha as well as outside, that Parliament was supreme and has primacy over the Constitution. The truth is, and this is what he seems to have forgotten, is that Parliament is the creation of the Constitution, and the Constitution has laid down not just the limitations of the functioning of Parliament, but also guidelines for its functioning. If anything is supreme, it has to be the Constituent Assembly which wrote the Constitution, but the body doesn't exist. And you certainly can't equate the present Parliament to a Constituent Assembly.
Yes, that's one point. The second point is, we should never get taken in by these. Firstly, anybody who stands on his chair, never listen to him. Anybody say, I am Vice President, I am so and so. No, don't listen to him. Secondly, never go for cliches that Parliament is supreme. See, that cliche comes from Britain, where they do not have a written constitution. And therefore, the Parliament was deemed to be supreme in its battle with the king over so many 100 years. But in our case, we have a constitution, and the constitution is supreme.
Even in Britain, where they've now created a Supreme Court,
Yes.
the Supreme Court, when Boris Johnson first became Prime Minister, actually found fault with his failure to allow Parliament to function and to call it and adjourn it early. Parliament was reconvened on the orders of the Supreme Court. So even in Britain, that attitude doesn't fully apply any longer.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So Dhankar has borrowed a cliche without understanding A, it doesn't apply in India, and B, even in Britain where it did once apply, its application is changing.
Yes, and I'm sure, having been a senior advocate, he would understand, he knows, and yet says.
So both of these gentlemen, you believe, are being put up by presumably the Prime Minister, and that this choice of language to denigrate or to dismiss or to lower is in fact something that the Prime Minister would approve of. He's in agreement with them.
Yes, I think so. Karan, we must see these speeches, etc., as part of a general attitude and design. And this thing is nothing to do with the Constitution. It has nothing to do with the judiciary coming in the way of the executive doing good work. It has to do with the fact of a totalitarian mentality. Totalitarian means total control over every institution, over every individual in every institution, over every act of that individual in every institution across the country. That's why.
So the attack on the judiciary is an expression of a totalitarian mentality.
Yes.
And that mentality is, I presume, the Prime Minister's, because these gentlemen can't act without his permission.
I would think so. I mean, I don't want to now get into a controversy with the Vice President, a constitutional authority, acts on the directions of the Prime Minister. No. But the general presumption about the regime is that they are heading in one direction. If you see what they say about the media, about civil society, about activists working on human rights, it's all that mentality.
Okay.
But
can I point this out? This is not the first time since independence that the judiciary has been attacked by the executive of the day. It happened when Indira Gandhi was calling for a committed judiciary. It happened when she superseded senior judges to make Justice Ray the Chief Justice. It happened again when she superseded Justice Khanna. So attacks on the judiciary from the executive of the day, particularly when the Prime Minister is deemed to be powerful or, in quotes, totalitarian, is not uncommon in our country.
Yes, and what did the predecessors of the Prime Minister and others say? What did Atal Bihari Vajpayee say at that time? And Mr. Advani say at that time when Mrs. Gandhi superseded the judges? Or when they attacked the basic structure during the Constitution?
Remind me, what did they say?
Oh, they said that this is all nothing but dictatorship. Advani ji wrote on that matter in his prison diary. There's a wonderful book of his called The Prison Diary. In that he says precisely that the basic structure is the dike, and therefore they opposed the 42nd Amendment. They opposed the 39th Amendment, by which Mrs. Gandhi's election was certified not to have been corrupt, because those 4 practices on which he had been found to be corrupt were said to be never have been corrupt.
So presumably, if Mr.
And therefore, when Mrs. Gandhi did those things, there was the totalitarian mentality behind it.
And that mentality is visible today again.
Again, but in a very different form, in a much more systematic form, in a much more determined form, in a much more thoroughly orchestrated form.
But something else also follows. If Mr. Vajpayee were alive today, he would be equally critical of what the Modi government is doing to the judiciary. And if Mr. Advani were to speak, he would be similarly equally critical of what Mr. Modi and its government is doing to the judiciary.
I cannot tell you how distressed they would be to see that the party they had founded is doing all this. No doubt at all. And they looked upon the judiciary as the final dike that keeps the Constitution going, therefore the country going. Individual leaders come and go.
And when that dike is breached, the flood waters will drown all of us.
Absolutely.
But you know, the truth, Mr. Shourie, is that in this battle, and it is becoming a battle between the executive and the legislature on the one hand and the judiciary on the other, judges haven't always acted in their own best interest or to help their cause. There are innumerable occasions when the Supreme Court has been silent and has not defended constitutional governance or institutions, as the executives of the day have steadily undermined them. The silence of the judiciary actually becomes part of its weakness as well, because they don't stand up.
Yes, and you see, and they must realize that in the end, the protection for them will not be the constitution, but it will be that when the people feel that when they are attacked, something of great value to the people is under attack, then alone will they be secure. That goes for the media, that goes for the bureaucracy, that goes for the judiciary. But today, these encroachments, if I may say, denigration, does not create the response among the people, because the people do not see these persons. They think they are sitting very far away.
That's right. Their silence works against them.
Yes.
You know, the truth is, and here's a telling example. Over 60 years ago, the Supreme Court in the Karan Thapar Singh judgment read down the sedition law. And the Supreme Court has reaffirmed that several times, most recently in 2016. And yet the central government, the state governments, and virtually every single police force in the country not only ignores what the Supreme Court has done, but deliberately and knowingly misapplies the law. Yeah. Now that is contempt of court. But the Supreme Court has, leave aside spoken, it certainly hasn't acted to check these people. And therefore for 60 years, a Supreme Court judgment has been deliberately, repeatedly flouted, and all we've got is deafening silence from the court. This is an instance where the court should have rapped people on the knuckles, but it's quietly stood by and let it happen.
Yes, and I should not speak much on this because I'm one of the petitioners to the Supreme Court in regard to please take up the sedition matter, either declare it unconstitutional or read it in this particular way. But you are right. Supposing we set that aside, just look at the cases which have been tabulated by a wonderful group called Article 14. You can see them. That Karan files a complaint against me that Arun Shourie's motorcycle creates such a noise that it wakes up and disturbs the infant son of my sister. Therefore, it is sedition case. So on such idiotic grounds, sedition comes about. And
in fact, Article 14 shows that the use of sedition between 216 and 219, these figures now may be out of date because we're 3 years beyond 219, increased 160 times.
Yes.
I mean, that's an astonishing increase, and that is an indication both of the deliberate misuse of sedition by the government and the damning effect of the Supreme Court permitting it to happen, even though it's contempt of court and flouting of a Supreme Court judgment. Here, the Supreme Court's failure to act has given the government carte blanche and impunity.
Yes, and things that are visible. For instance, Supreme Court has a series of judgments on what's called the rule of proportionality. I commit an offence, the punishment that you will impose upon me must be proportional. Okay, what about this bulldozer justice? You're not seeing it. Everybody is seeing it. People are suffering, and you don't see it. Just take the question of in the same thing. In the last 5 years, 669 persons have died in police custody. Anybody suffered on that account? Anybody in the executive?
These are all instances where the court should have been there defending the rights of Indian citizens, their liberties and their privileges, and the court's silence weakens the court in this continuing battle, which is getting worse, between the legislature and the executive and the judiciary. The court, as I said, is not helping itself by its behavior.
Yes, and it is not helping itself when it intervenes with double standards. I'll give you an instance. You know, this journal, a rape takes place, Hathras, and this poor girl is raped and killed.
You're talking of Siddiq Kapan.
Yes, Siddiq Kapan. He then goes to cover it. He is taken up.
Before he even reaches Hathras.
Hathras, yes. And he is put in, and under the UAPA draconian law, and it takes him 28 months to come out.
And in contrast, Arnab Goswami in 24 hours is released.
Released. Not even released, anticipatory bill.
And forgive me, but I think I'm right in saying that the present Chief Justice was the judge who released Arnab Goswami and made a grand statement about liberty even for 24 hours being pressured was wrong. That concern and that sentiment somehow didn't apply to Kapan.
Yes. And it didn't apply, lower courts were not affected by his saying all this in the Supreme Court.
This is another instance of how the Supreme Court weakens itself in the battle vis-a-vis the legislature and the executive.
Yes.
These double standards suggest, let's be honest, hypocrisy.
This is known as the Chancellor's foot. The Chancellor's foot was very flexible.
Absolutely.
And elastic.
But there's one more instance of how the Supreme Court fails to do itself merit and defend its cause. And that's when retired Chief Justices or retired judges, sometimes 5 weeks after their retirement, accept government jobs. Satha Sivam did it when he became governor of Kerala, Ranjan Gogoi when he became a Rajya Sabha member, and now 2 days ago, Abdul Nazir has been made governor of Andhra Pradesh. And then side by side, you have sitting judges who are still serving in the Supreme Court, who publicly, sycophantically praise the Prime Minister, knowing that this is not just unbecoming, it raises serious question marks about judicial ethics. But all of this happens again, and no one punishes them.
Yes. And actually, Karan, it's not so much hypocrisy as the fact that they are undermining their own credibility, and thereby, in the fight against a determined enemy, they are weakening their own fortress. They are undermining their own fortress.
Arun Jaitley, when he was law minister in 2013, so before he became law minister, said, he was in the opposition in those days, that a post-retirement job raises questions about pre-retirement judgments. And when the media starts spelling out, and I won't be invidious and go into details, but when the media spells out the particular judgments that Justice Abdul Nazir was an author of or was party to, right? And they include things like demonetization, they include things like Ayodhya. It raises doubts in people's minds whether there is a connection between one and the other. I'm not saying there is, but that doubt itself is a worm that eats into the credibility of the judiciary.
But certainly you can say that without any inhibition about Arun Mishra's judgments and becoming the chairman of the Human Rights Commission.
And he was one of the judges who, whilst a judge, was praising the Prime Minister.
Absolutely. And Gogoi's sort of very helpful service in the Rafale case. I'll tell you why. How they destroy their credibility. Do you know, in the judgment, if you read Gogoi's judgment, and I was surprised how Justice Joseph was a party to it, they say, and there is the CAG report, which clears it, and it has been placed in Parliament, and it has been released to the public. It's in the judgment. There was no CAG report.
At the time?
Yes. I am not saying that the CAG is God, but there was no report.
The judgment itself was based upon a fact that was an untruth.
Absolute. So it was a very serviceable judgment.
And that is one of the Chief Justices who shortly after retirement, I think a couple of months in his instance, became a Rajya Sabha member. But all of these, and I'm going to pause at this moment, prove two things. There is an ongoing battle, and I don't think the word battle is wrong, between the legislature and the executive on the one hand and the judiciary on the other. It's a concerted attack where you believe the law minister and the vice president are voicing opinions that are obviously pleasing to the Prime Minister. Yes. This is a concerted, but on the other hand, and this is the flip side, the judiciary also is guilty of lapses, as a result of which it's weakening its own position by failing to stand up for its own judgments, by being sycophantic to the Prime Minister of the day, by double standards. The example was Siddiq Kapan versus Arnab Goswami. In other words, the Supreme Court itself is not helping itself.
I think that the judiciary as a whole, you say that in the high courts also in the same pattern. And one thing, you made a distinction between the executive and the parliament versus the judiciary. But actually speaking, this is also another cliche we should get rid of. We think of this as the parliamentary system. The executive is responsible to the parliament, who are the judicial fellows to come into the picture. But actually, in a system like the parliamentary system, especially as it works in India, the executive is the executive precisely because it controls the parliament, not the other way around. And this has been put out of any doubt by this 10th schedule of anti-defamation.
Absolutely, and that's a very fair point you make. Let's though narrowly stick to our subject, which is to do with this attack on the judiciary. We've discussed in detail who's doing it. We've discussed in detail the extent to which the Supreme Court is permitting it to happen through its weakness. Let's now come to the more important point. What should the Supreme Court do about this attack? because it's in the interest of our country, our democracy, and our constitution that the Supreme Court stand up. Now, you've given me a paper on this, and you've mentioned 3 or 4 critical points. Let's go through those 3-4 points one by one. First, you say the Supreme Court should see the pattern of what is being done. That pattern is critical, and therefore they need very carefully to select and schedule cases. They should assess the significance of a case and then give that case priority. Explain to the audience, why is this pattern important, and why is scheduling cases in terms of their significance important?
Because, as I mentioned to you, the pattern, it's not atishbazi that is going on. Some isolated statement, some isolated act, some isolated defiance of the court, or some isolated not responding to what the court's directions were. It is part of a general pattern. If you see RTI, if you see anything, the same pattern is going on. So they must wake up to that pattern. And even in the selection, it's a very small point, but even in the selection of cases, please see what is the usefulness of this particular case in defending the system as a whole, and on the other side, how will my negligence of not taking up this case just now help the government in undermining the system as a whole?
Accordingly, give that case priority.
Priority, yes.
But sadly, that is something the Supreme Court almost deliberately has not been doing for the last 5-6 years. I mean, cases of critical constitutional importance, the abrogation of Article 370, electoral bonds, the Citizenship Amendment Act, all of those were deliberately kicked down the road by the Supreme Court until very, very recently. And presumably, they were kicked down the road because the court knew that were they to be heard, the outcome would embarrass the government. And so to protect the government from embarrassment, they refused to entertain the case.
Yes, that's why. A very good example, as you gave, is electoral bonds. It undermines a very basic feature of the system, that is elections. It's not just, it is institutionalization, not just of corruption, but of extortion to undermine the electoral system.
So it should have been heard immediately.
Immediately. And it just goes on and on.
It's only just being taken up by Justice Chandrachud after he became Chief Justice in November. But you make a second point in that document you gave me. The second point you say is this: the Supreme Court needs to indicate its seriousness in ensuring that its own judgments are followed and not flouted or violated. And you say the way to do this is twofold. One, the Supreme Court needs to monitor how its judgments are being respected and observed. And secondly, when it discovers that its judgments are being flouted or ignored, it needs to punish. Yes. Both monitoring and punishment are essential.
Yes, and monitoring, the court can't do everything, but when it gives a direction, you can say, X, Karan Thapar, Secretary of such and such, will be the one who will report, or let's say the Director General of Police in UP will report every time a sedition case or a murder case is registered involving, let's say, a legislator. And you designate it that it shall come to this particular website, email address of the registrar. And the registrar, and also try and involve youngsters. Article 14 people, alt news people, they'll be so honored and anxious to assist the court. You give them this data will come to you. You tell them, once a month, give me a report on all this.
Beyond being honored, these are people who are actually professionally looking into lapses, looking into mistruths, and the Supreme Court should benefit and take advantage of a service they're providing.
They will be happily provide.
Because the Supreme Court on its own can't do it, therefore use them, because ensuring, A, that monitoring of judgments happen, and B, people who violate them are punished is important.
Monitoring of your directions, because it's not just a judgment you are giving. It's not an essay you have written. You have given a specific direction.
Which is the order of the land.
Yes. For instance, there's a very famous case called Prakash Singh, in which the Supreme Court laid down the reforms that must be undertaken for the police to be
over
insulated.
10 years ago.
The case of Satinder Dubey, a man who was killed because he reported corruption in the construction of highways. So, big hangama took place. So, the government issued an ordinance to protect whistleblowers. They passed an act to protect whistleblowers. How many years ago? 2014. And that act...
These are
No,
all
just one second.
instances
Just
where
one
the
second.
Supreme Court should have monitored and followed up.
No, so I'll tell you, the act had this standard clause, this shall come into effect the day it is notified. So for 8 years, no notification.
So it's not come into effect. And the Prakash Singh judgment, which is over 10 years old, specifically laid down processes and criteria that must be followed by police forces all across. And here, not just the central government, more importantly, state governments, because police come under state, have ignored them.
Right.
And this has been brought to the Supreme Court's attention by Mr. Prakash Singh, but the Supreme Court has done nothing. So
I'll give you another...
this is where, let's not get lost in detail, this is where monitoring and then punishing when violation or ignoring of their judgments happens is essential. Let me, in this instance, cite to you what the last Chief Justice of India, Justice Lalit, said to me in an interview literally days after he retired. He said, if the government refuses to accept collegium recommendations which have been reiterated not once, but twice or thrice, then the Supreme Court must haul up for contempt the law secretary, not the law minister, but the law secretary. And I want to ask you, A, is focusing on the law secretary rather than the minister sufficient? Should it not be the minister himself or herself? Because the secretary is just a civil servant doing his minister's bidding. The minister is the deciding authority.
So the first point to remember, maybe your viewers would like to know, what's the law laid down by the Supreme Court in this regard? That when the collegium recommends certain names, the government can, in the first instance, react on, let's say, some names and send them back, please reconsider. But if the collegium reiterates that recommendation unanimously, then the government must act on it. And it repeatedly does not act on it, and the Supreme Court does not haul up. Why just the law secretary? Also the law minister?
So you agree? You
Elected
disagree
official,
with Justice Lalit? You agree
official.
that it should be the law minister, not just the secretary?
Because the poor secretary is just following, in any case, the orders of the minister.
So what you're saying is that even though Justice Lalit is in agreement with you that after repeated reiterations the government still refuses, there must be some punishment, but you're saying don't punish the secretary. The secretary is just a civil servant doing his minister's bidding. Go to the minister, that's the deciding authority.
Yes, but also on all matters, environment regulator, there shall be, in the Lafarge case, again 11 years old, there shall be an independent environmental regulator. No regulator appointed, and you do nothing. So therefore the government's attitude is, अरे यार वो भाषण दे रहे हैं, देने दो. वो ऐसे लिख रहे हैं, लिखने दो.
This is the attitude of the government that will change if the Supreme Court takes action when its orders and instructions are ignored.
Yes.
This is why monitoring and punishing is essential.
Yes.
Now, in that document you gave me, there's a third suggestion you make, and in some senses, I would say it's the most radical of the lot. You say, and I'm quoting you, judges should step out of their chambers and actively examine measures which are necessary for the life of citizens and which show the authorities are not doing their job. Now, when I read that sentence, I said to myself, if judges actually do this, they're moving away from being just judges sitting on a Supreme Court bench, and they're becoming like investigation agencies. Some people would say they're almost becoming like policemen and even detectives. Are you sure that they should go this far? Because it's a level of judicial activism that's far greater than we've seen up till now.
No, but they should be. I'll give you an instance. How far is the Jamuna from the Supreme Court? How many judgments have there been on cleaning up the Jamuna? How many times have journalists and newspapers published photographs of that foam of the chemicals floating on the Jamuna? You can't travel 2 miles and see. Everybody will be on toes if you did that.
That's a very interesting example. If you really mean what you say when you pronounce these judgments, you're saying to judges, get into your car, it's already paid by the government, drive across to the Jamuna, have a look, the extent to which your judgment is being flouted, and then raise that issue. Because it will prove not just that you care about your judgment being observed, but it also proves you care about the situation.
Yes. Aravali, how many times illegal mining on Aravali Hills? It goes on. We publish photographs. But
so you're saying in the greater interest both of the people and of the judiciary, this level of enhanced activism is not just acceptable, it's necessary.
Yes, and you must do this with confidence. I'll tell you, these fellows who will say, oh, activism, Lakshman Rekha ko cross kar rahe hain, they will always say it. But look at the evolution of judicial intervention and supervision, what has happened? How have people reacted to it? How has the system reacted to it? You know, in the original frame of things, it was that the speaker's judgment in regard to the legislatures or legislators is final. But the speakers were so biased in their judgment that the legislators themselves ran to the courts and the courts gave verdict. Governor's rule, it was no executive will do it. But then the people came, the political parties themselves came, and there were famous cases like Nagaland, which then circumscribed what the government could do.
So you're saying that if the Supreme Court could intervene for very good reason, either in the instance of speakers and their judgments in Parliament or governor's rule, then they can extend that activism to also ensure that dictates and judgments that they're given on other subjects are observed and punished when they're not.
When they're and
Now
just one second. So one is look, and therefore get into the car and sometimes look. I don't say every day or every judgment. You can get other people to look for you, but look. But also, if I may add, look at how you are yourself contributing to undermining the system. One example, the rule is Supreme Court judgments are bail, not jail. What is the rule today?
Jail, not bail.
Bail. So it's not the Prime Minister who's signing the non-bail order, it's a judge. It's a magistrate.
This is an instance where you look into yourself and say, we are undermining the system because we are not giving bail where it should be given, or we're making it almost impossible to get.
And that we are flouting our own judgments.
Now you go one step further, because there's a fourth suggestion you make, and you say, and I'm quoting you once again, you also believe judges must, and I'm quoting you, speak out, because you add, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The problem is that if judges, as judges, start speaking out, won't they be deemed to be becoming political? Some people will say they're becoming crusaders. And won't that drag them into controversy?
No. Firstly, all judgments drag you into controversy. That doesn't matter. On Adani, you just say, okay, I will now come into the thing and divert the issue. So it's not the fear of the controversy. But wonderful thing has been done by the Chief Justice of India today in speaking out about judicial independence, about the basic structure. He has been speaking. He's an erudite person. He speaks out. That is,
you're talking about the statement made by Justice Chandrachud when he said the basic structure is the North Star.
Yes.
It's the guiding point for us.
Yes, that was one.
In direct refutation of Vice President Thankar.
And similarly, when the collegium released the so-called secret reports given by the government about persons, why they are not putting them into the court, confirming their appointment, judgeships. That was speaking out. And it was welcomed and it silenced the government.
And you're saying more such speaking out must happen?
That is by the judges, but why confine it only to the judges? Yes, there are limitations, but retired judges, Justice A.P. Shah speaks out, Justice Lokar speaks out in your interviews, in everywhere else. So why not 50 such judges who are concerned about the system speaking out all over the country? It will have a great impact.
So speaking out is the duty not just of sitting judges, but also, and perhaps even more so, of retired judges, because the constraints that apply on sitting judges won't apply on retired judges.
And secondly, of the bar. The bar used to be such an effective shield.
The legal fraternity as a whole must speak out.
Yes, speak up.
Now, alongside all of this, in that document you gave me, you also sound a very important note of caution. Judges, you say, must be extra careful there are no double standards that raise doubts about their credibility. One such double standard, I presume, was the difference in treatment between Siddiq Kappan and Arnab Goswami.
Yes.
What are the sort of other double standards that you're worried about?
On every matter, I can tell you, there's the looting of bank. Not you are a very important person. A poor shopkeeper is not able to repay a loan to the bank. And supposing the case goes to the court, how will the court act? And all these big fellows looting the banks and living happily ever after.
The richer you are, And if you are in debt to the bank, it becomes a problem for the bank.
Yes.
The poorer you are, and your debt may be very small, it's a huge problem for you.
Yes.
This is the double standard.
This is the double standard in effect, and it is visible to everybody.
Okay. We're coming to the end of this interview.
No, also, hate speech. अपने चाकू sharpen कीजिए. You think this is being done just for cutting vegetables? Or she is saying it for that? Has any action been taken? What is about this suo motu notice by the judges? And somebody else says, I think it was Mr. Amit Shah or somebody who said during the election, or somebody said, I forget what I just read in the papers, कि 2002 में
उनको सबक सिखा दिया.
हाँ, सबक
It
सिखाया.
was Amit Shah.
अमित शाह जो सबक सिखाया था, तो इसलिए यहाँ शांति रही है.
These are instances where the judges should have taken suo motu action themselves.
No, not only that, but see the persons who have been arrested for hate speech or proceeded against for hate speech, and these have evoked no reaction from the judiciary. Similarly, I told you about the bulldozer justice. These are double standards, and actually.
And you're making a very important point. Judges have no qualms taking action against unimportant small people who are guilty of hate speech. That hate speech is hateful. Action undoubtedly had to be taken. But when people like Amit Shah or BJP MPs indulge in hate speech, the judges mustn't be silent. The same activeness must be displayed there too.
It's not only just that the other people are small or unimportant, like students, but also that they are persons who are in the bad books of the current rulers. That's the problem. That's where the double standards come, and thereby the credibility of the judiciary is undermined.
And therefore, when the judiciary is being asked by you to be more activist, to monitor and punish, at the same time you're saying, but be very careful that you do not fall guilty of your own double standards, because that will undermine your credibility. You can only speak out, you can only monitor and punish those who flout your judgments if you are yourself full of rectitude.
Rectitude, and one aspect of rectitude is that you are blind. That's why that lady of justice, she is blindfold, that you are not discriminating between one and the other. And certainly not that a person who's a ruler and a person who's a subject.
It's a very interesting example to make. Justice is blind so that you don't discriminate between one and another,
right,
between rich and poor, influential and unimportant. But that blindfold must be removed if it's stopping you doing proper justice.
And from seeing, blindfold doesn't mean, be like one of those monkeys who doesn't see.
You must see. My last question, the note you gave me ends with the following sentence. To blunt the assault against the judiciary, the defense must be comprehensive, across the board, it must be unrelenting. The judiciary must not give in on any issue at all. And as I read that, I was half in agreement with you, but the other half of my mind said, this is beginning to sound a bit like a strategy for war. But then is it a war? It is.
It is a war. It is a war in defense of the Constitution. You are fighting in defense of the Constitution. So if you feel that, if I'm reasonable on this matter, reasonable in courts, if I give him a little bit here, he will be satisfied. No, it will whet his appetite.
For more.
For more, and he will regard that concession as a weakness, as
so
a symptom of weakness.
What you're saying in that sentence to the judiciary is that you are fighting a war, but it's a war in defense of the Constitution.
Right.
And that's why you have to be unrelenting. That's why you must not give in on any issue at all.
And on those issues that affect the basic structure which you have identified, which is the foundation of the Constitution, those pillars, on those never compromise. Don't think that a convoluted or well-rounded sentence here or there will assuage the fellow and yet preserve the value. No. He will interpret it in his own way.
And what you're saying to the judges, because I'm sure several of them, both serving and retired, will be hearing you, is that in this battle, vis-a-vis the judiciary, the executive, the legislature, it is a war, and you mustn't simply play it in terms of tactics and strategy. You must be unrelenting, because the judiciary has to win.
Yes.
We cannot afford for our judges to lose.
Right. And that you will never lose. I'll tell you, this is an example, if you permit me to end with Gandhiji. Gandhiji goes to Champaran, indigo cultivators. He asked the government, please set up a committee, mass processions and all. Now, if they don't set up the committee, if they set up the committee, he wins. People win. Their condition is examined. The British rule British Empire has bended to a half-naked fellow. If they don't set up the committee, he wins, because he tells the people, see, they will not even set up a committee for you, and you are looking upon them as my bab. The same thing.
The judiciary must similarly catch the government within the horns of a dilemma to ensure that either way, judges win, constitution wins, justice wins, and the government is shown up.
And it'll win. Why? If the executive bends and does the right thing, then the right thing has got done. If it does not bend and is obstinate and says,
it's shown up. It's shown up.
No, it's shown up, and people are then made to feel that yes, the flood has reached from here to here. Wake up. So you have done a signal service either way.
Absolutely. I thank you for this interview, Arun Shourie. I hope both serving and retired judges listen to you, because you are perhaps the first former minister, former editor, and still a highly regarded author who's actually addressed himself to this issue of great concern. And you're saying to them, as no Indian citizen has said before to judges, you need to act in your own defense, but you need to have no double standards. But remember, this is a war for the constitution and justice. I hope they listen to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on The Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.